Chapter 39 to 40, Joseph goes down to Egypt, where he is sold as a slave to a man called Potiphar. He acts wisely in his house, and he becomes the chief steward. And God is with him because he is honest, and he looks after the place well, and he's competent, and he's promoted to a position, even though he's a slave in the house, and he attracts the eye of Potiphar's wife, Potiphar's wife, who accuses him of trying to rape her and has him thrown into prison. Again, he's treated with great injustice here and ends up in prison. Chapter 40 is in prison, and he's given again a position of responsibility because of his trustworthy nature. And while he's in the prison, he interprets the dreams of the butler and the baker who had offended Pharaoh and been thrown into prison. The interpretation which Joseph gives is favorable to the butler, telling him he's going to be restored to his position under Pharaoh, but not favorable to the baker, who he says is going to be hanged. And that's exactly what happens. He tells the butler as he's restored to Pharaoh not to forget him, to remember him, but he doesn't. So once again, Joseph is the victim of people's indifference and bad treatment. Chapter 41, 2 years pass by and Pharaoh has a dream. Let's actually read that dream because dreams are pretty important in this story. Chapter 41, verse 1. Came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream, and behold, he stood by the river. Suddenly there came up out of the river 7 cows, fine-looking and fat, and they fed in the meadow. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them out of the river, ugly and gaunt, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the river. And the ugly and gaunt cows ate up the 7 fine-looking and fat cows, so Pharaoh awoke. He slept and dreamed a second time, and suddenly 7 heads of grain came up on one stalk, plump and good. And behold, 7 thin heads, blighted by the east wind, sprang up after them. And the 7 thin heads devoured the 7 plump and full heads, so Pharaoh awoke, and indeed it was a dream. Now it came to pass in this morning that his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all the wise men, and Pharaoh told them his dreams, and there was not one who could interpret them for Pharaoh. And the chief butler then speaks up to Pharaoh and says, I remember that when I was in prison there was a young Hebrew man there who was able to interpret my dream. Maybe he can interpret your dream. And they fetch Joseph out of the prison, and Joseph interprets the dream. He says to Pharaoh in verse 25, the dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads are 7 years. The dreams are one. And the 7 thin and ugly cows which came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty heads, blighted by the east wind, are 7 years of famine. This is the thing which I have spoken to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. Indeed, 7 years of great plenty will come throughout all the land of Egypt, but after them 7 years of famine will arise, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine will deplete the land. And he goes on to say that Pharaoh, in verse 33, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this, let him appoint officers over the land to collect 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 plentiful years. Let them gather all the food of those good years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh, and let them keep the food in the cities. Then that food shall be as a reserve for the land for the 7 years of famine which will be in the land of Egypt, that the land may not perish during the famine. So Joseph gives some good news, or gives good advice. And he tells them about how Pharaoh can survive this coming famine. Interesting actually about the 7 years. Just occurs to me. 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. Anyway, Pharaoh says, well, okay, Joseph, you got the job. Do it yourself. He says, how can we find such a wise man amongst the people of Egypt who can do this? And Joseph suddenly passes from being a Hebrew in prison to being the second ruler in Egypt under Pharaoh. And says Joseph was 30 years old when he starts this ministry. Anybody else who started their ministry at the age of 30? Yeah, sure. Jesus, yeah. Another one of the parallels.